What's the one thing that can captivate investors, inspire your team, and close deals with customers? The answer is simpler than you think. It's the art of storytelling. 2011, a founder was struggling to gain traction for her online platform. She knew the market potential was huge, but investors didn't seem to care. No matter how much data she presented or how technically sound her product was, it wasn't enough to break through the noise. After several failed pitches, she tried something new. She stopped focusing on product and started telling a personal story about why she built it. This time something clicked. Investors connected with the mission behind the company, not just the mechanics. That founder was Whitney Wolfe Herd, the founder of Bumble. By shifting her approach and telling the story of how her own experiences shaped the company's vision, she turned Bumble into a billion-dollar brand and disrupted the online dating space. Today, we're discussing the art of storytelling, how to use a founder use storytelling to pitch your product, inspire your team, and persuade investors. We'll break down what makes a story resonate and how you can use it to build lasting relationships with customers, employees, and partners. All that, and we discuss how to hit the record button on today's How to Founder.
Oh, yeah. It's your professionalism that I respect.
Hello, my name is Chris Franks.
And I'm Anthony Franco. How to Founder is where you, the founder, discover tips, tricks, and details that MBA professors refuse. They will not. They are financially rewarded to not tell you the things that we're about to tell you. This is the insider scoop on how to be a founder.
I do like the fact that we're suddenly just like, it just escalates every episode, and they hate you.
Yes, I'm making it. I'm trying to work on my dramatic readings. And I know I have a long way to go here.
Oh, I think you're doing pretty good, and you've made enemies of every MBA professor. So great job with that as well, which is always fun. So before we get started, Anthony, tell us a story about hitting record. I think it's a great story.
So we're 2 for 2 right now, Chris. We didn't have audio on during Denver Startup Week on one of our podcasts, and then yesterday we talked about the art of storytelling, and it was a brilliant podcast. And then recognized that we failed to hit the record button. So this is V2. This is V2. And normally we don't record. Normally we go live. So we're recording it because you're out of town tomorrow. So this is a pre-recorded live stream when you're watching it.
This is a pre-recorded. So that's why, we normally get thousands of comments. Today we're not going to have comments. Sorry, it's just Anthony and I. It's amazing. All right, so let's get into it, Anthony. I think storytelling is one of the most important things that a founder can do. But let's just start with the premise here. Like the big question, do I need to be a good storyteller to be a founder? I think it's important. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think I was a skeptic, a huge skeptic on storytelling. It felt touchy-feely. It felt like I need to worry about this thing called feeling. And I don't want to do that. I like spreadsheets and coding and logic and then couldn't figure out why my sales pitches fell flat. And so I wouldn't say quickly learned, but I learned eventually that storytelling is really kind of it is typically the best way to communicate a mission or a vision or values and get somebody else motivated to think the way you're thinking. Took me a while.
I'm glad that you've come around to our camp here of the storytelling being the skill. I will add on to that with a bit of hyperbole and say that I believe that being able to tell a story as a founder is as important as every single technical skill that you have. So if you're a great coder, if you're a great marketer, you're a great salesperson, you're a great product person, et cetera, I think for you as a founder, developing the skills, it is skills, it's not attributes, developing the skills of a storyteller is critically important for your success. And I think, we can dive into the why in a moment, but I just, to me, the notion of every great founder that pops into your head, when I say, who are the great founders of our generation, I will point to how they are a terrific storyteller. Do you agree with that?
No, Elon Musk is a terrible storyteller.
I actually disagree, and here's the reason why. So
he's a good interviewer. Actually, he can tell some good stories. But if you've ever seen his product demos, they fall a little short of what Steve Jobs used to do.
It's true, but I've heard, I've met people, and he kind of is in the same generation as we are as entrepreneurs, and so we've met people that know him, and I've met his brother a few times. But the people say that when he comes into a room, he has the largest reality distortion field of anybody that you can do that. So when he walks in the room, he's like, yeah, right, like space is easy. It's just about price per pound of square force in a rocket, and people are like, oh yeah, it's easy.
Well, I want to tug on something that you said, Chris, and so you talked about you said something I don't think you mean, which is storytelling is as important as any technical knowledge that you have or technical skill that you have. And in reality, storytelling is kind of technical. Like it isn't a soft skill. It can be a hard skill. And I'd like you to talk a little, tell me, so for everybody watching, Chris is the resident storytelling expert. He tells a lot of them.
You're saying that
but talk about that, the technical aspects, like why is it a skill and why isn't it something that you just were born with?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point. And so to start with a larger point, and then to answer your question directly, Anthony, which is we as society, we as human beings, our species, we are hardwired to understand stories. Well before we had the written word, stories is how we transfer knowledge from one another. And so today we now know, we've proven the fact that if I give you information in a story, you're way more likely to remember that information than if I were just to give you the information, just, hey, some statistic, right? So I think that that's a really critical thing. However, there's a notion, it's a little bit of a myth that just people are born great storytellers. And there are certainly people that have, sort of more natural charisma or things like that. However, everybody can learn the technical skills of being a storyteller. Every single person can. It is not something that anybody is born with this innate gift to tell great stories. Sure, there's people that have, more natural gifts than others, but storytelling is mechanical. It is something you can walk through. It is a process. It is a series of steps, and you can learn those skills. It is not something you're born with. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. Well, you talked about it in a general sense, but let's maybe we should cover the why first. So why is storytelling so powerful?
Yeah, so it's terrific, and there's I don't want to say emerging, because I think it's now kind of emerged field of both psychology and neuroscience around why is it that stories resonate more, et cetera. The reality is that stories form deeper and longer lasting neural pathways, so memory pathways in your brain. And there's lots of reasons why. There's including heuristics and biases and things like that we can talk about if we really want to geek out. But stories by nature are things that get people engaged and will make your company, your business, your story you're trying to tell more memorable for the person listening. And so the first thing I would say, our first kind of large piece of advice, or my first large piece of advice, is start crafting whatever you're talking about with your business. Start crafting it as a story. Start telling, particularly early on, your story as it pertains to the business, because we know how much more it will resonate with an audience. And again, this is now pretty well proven scientifically that stories are the way that people remember and relate to information.
Well, I mean, look, our species survival was dependent on tribal knowledge, right? Like before there was the written word, the way things were passed along was through stories, and those stories helped the tribe survive and grow and thrive because they, Bob got eaten by a mammoth, a woolly mammoth. So let's not go over by the woolly mammoths anymore. Like that story.
I was just about to applaud how smart we were, how scholarly we were.
Bob and woolly mammoth. Come on. I mean,
eaten by a woolly mammoth. They were herbivores, man. They didn't eat people.
Trampled by a woolly mammoth. How's that?
That's fine.
All right.
Imagine a modern.
You don't know if they were. You don't know. They could have looked at us and thought we were plants.
That's a good belief right there.
All right. So the why, you kind of covered the why. The why is because scientifically and practically it ingrains memory and underscores your connection to the problem that you're trying to convey.
I think it's well said, Anthony. And to summarize, it just works better than delivering information in a non-story form.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about. I asked the audience to think about their own experience in this. When you're looking at a PowerPoint slide with a bunch of bullet points and information, or what's the more engaging presentations you've seen? Is it the TED Talks where people are telling stories, or the PowerPoint presentation you sit in a meeting to understand the data behind whatever it is that you're in the meeting for? Like, it's certainly the storytelling that is more engaging, and you probably remember a lot more.
I completely agree. So I think that we can settle on the fact that, okay, we know now that telling stories for founders is super important. But let's get into the nitty gritty here. So let's start talking about how we do that.
Yeah. Chris, what are some of the skills that entrepreneurs need to practice in order to be a good storyteller?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing we can do is talk about the components of every story, right? So we know that, and this is something that's funny. It's because people get this wrong a lot, and it's really, really simple. But when you're doing it, sometimes you kind of forget the components of it. So let's run down the components of the story, Anthony. What do you have to have in the beginning? Beginning of everything.
An inciting incident.
Yeah, inciting incident. You have to have a character, right? Sometimes that character is you. You have to have a person. You have to have something that is creating some sort of setup here, right? I was unhappy in my day job, and I started thinking that maybe I should be a founder. You have a character, you have a situation that's starting to create a little bit of tension.
You have you have a little bit of tension, the unhappiness. Yeah.
So it's you have to have a main character, and a lot of this revolves around a story archetype known as the hero's journey, which we can get into if it's pretty geeky, but this notion that every hero follows a similar trajectory in the story. But so you have to have that first thing, that situation that kind of creates a little bit of tension. And then that next part is there needs to be some sort of real tension or conflict that's created. There's not a story that's like Anthony and Chris got together and then they had lunch at the end. Like, it's just, that's a boring story, right? stories, and we start to think about these a little bit more deeply, and we remember them more when there's some sort of conflict, some sort of tension that's created and we call that rising conflict, right? Or rising tension in a story, whereby the person, the listener, the comprehender of the story now gets a little bit engaged, right? Give me an example of tension moments that you've given, stories that you tell as far as business pitches go.
Well, so I mean, the traditional story arc, right, for almost every rom-com is likable guy wants girl, likable guy gets girl, likable guy becomes not likable guy, loses girl, and then he turns himself around and gets the girl again. Right?
Like
that's
right.
That's the traditional story arc. But if you translate that to business, what I used to, one example is for effective, the story was people want to engage with your business, but your business software sucks. Therefore, they don't engage. They're frustrated with your business and go elsewhere. Let's make your tool not suck so people are happy with your customers, or your customers are happy with your company, right?
Yeah.
So that's the story. That's a very traditional story arc.
Right. But your customers, right? Those customers is something I should care deeply about as a founder. Your customers are the main character. Their inability to relate to you is the conflict, right? That's a perfect start to a good story. And it should create, if you're a founder, when you tell that story, like, oh, fuck, it should create a sense of tension for you, right? Because if people want to engage with your business and are having a hard time, like, ooh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I think the classic setups here is talking about a big problem. Like, what is the problem that your company is trying to solve, or your organization? Is it,
do you think it's a big problem, or just it can be a small problem?
I think it'd be a small problem too. I think the piece here is that, and it's really why when we talk to founders a lot, we really coach through what we call the problem statement, which is, can you clearly articulate the problem that exists for some person or group of people? And that creates the tension that you can build the rest of your business story around. Classic ones, we talk about Apple a lot because Steve Jobs was such a master storyteller, that these new innovative people are tired of using. The problem is they're boring machines, boring, drab machines. And then the Mac comes to the world and creates this new vision of what's possible with creativity. I mean, that's creating a sense of tension.
So I think there's actually two great examples of storytelling from Apple. One is the very famous commercial titled 1984.
It's the classic one, right? Yeah.
And the story arc is the man is suppressing you. It's suppressing your creativity.
Yeah, in this case, Big Brother, right?
They are, Big Brother. Let's break that and unleash your inner greatness, right? Like a great classic, only aired once, by the way, but it's hands down probably the most quoted commercial, and it told a really great story. The other one, the one that gets me choked up, actually, is their Think Different campaign. The Here's to the Great Ones. I think it's a terrific one, yeah. Richard Dreyfuss just telling the story of the odd ducks are the ones that changed the world. Like, talk about the tension and then the ultimate connection. And that went at its best, and you got to be really careful here, but at its best, your story not only conveys your point and your values and your mission and motivates, but can also have an impact beyond the story that you're telling.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Okay, so we've now got some tension. We got to do something else there if we just leave it. The example I used yesterday when we didn't press record is a good one, which is man takes elevator to the 35th floor, walks out to the balcony, and dangles his legs over the balcony, sits on the edge. So anyway, let's move on. We as humans immediately want to be like, whoa, wait. You need to finish that. You need to finish that because you've created a sense of tension there about what's about to happen.
Great storytelling is you're setting up the what is going to happen next. And if you don't answer that question, you've just ruined the whole reason for the story. People want to know what happens next.
Yeah, and how do you resolve that sense of tension that you just created? And so if I'm saying to the fact of, hey, I see a big problem. So I'm using ProFounder as an example. Hey, I see a big problem that founders are quitting this job, feeling lonely, feeling isolated, do not have places to plug in with each other or learn practical skills. That's a problem. It's a problem not only for founders, but it's a problem for society because founders are people that create value. So anyway, that's why Anthony and I talk every day. Like, that's not an end of the story.
Yeah.
Right? It just says, and we see this all the time, Anthony. It's one of the most common mistakes, and it drives me fucking insane. When you set up tension with saying, here's the problem our company is trying to solve, and then say, that's why we built this thing, without explicitly closing the loop and saying how, specifically how your solution solves this problem, right?
Yeah, it's usually problem solution without the connective tissue of why this solution solves this problem.
Right. And
that happens all the time.
Yeah, in some cases, it's because people, they don't want to say something that's implied, right? Like, you're just like, well, of course. Of course, our solution, I'm telling you what our solution does. But they never go back and explicitly say, ProFounder has built solutions to learn, connect, and grow, hoping to solve the problem of founder fatigue, connectedness, and learning.
It's Chris, I'd love you to dig on this because it is the most common mistake that salespeople and people looking for investment, people looking to convey a message and get people to act, right? That's fundamentally what you're trying to do in this context with storytelling, is to inspire action. And the most common problem is that connecting your problem statement with your solution statement. Here's what's the problem, here's the solution. And I think it is that you have mentally already connected the dots and therefore believe that your audience is going to connect the same dots. It's literally a blind spot. It's the definition of a blind spot.
I feel like we could riff off of this single thing for an hour. But so when I was a young, intrepid salesperson, like my first job in outside sales, my first sales trainer said, the number one mistake you can make is to show up and throw up. And what that means is you show up in a meeting and you have all this facts and knowledge in your head, right? And you know what the product does and what the feature, function, benefit, and et cetera. And you go, hey, how are you today? And they go, great. And you launch immediately into, cool, because I'm here to say this, blah, 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 and you just go through the list, right? The problem that we have as founders is we're intimately involved with how the shit is made. Like how the solution is built, what are the features, how we got there. And we care deeply about every single one of those bullets under the main story point, right? We care deeply because we're the ones doing it. We're the ones fighting the fight. The problem is that almost always we get too far into the weeds. We show up and throw up. We start talking about things that don't really matter for the overall story arc, which is the number one thing you can do if you're showing up in a sales meeting, if you're talking to a potential customer, a potential employee, potential investor, potential board member, advisor, is to tell this story and let them ask the questions of what specifically they'd like to dive into. So if you come in and say, like, let me tell you every feature that we have built with ProFounder Network, you're going to lose people. But if I just stick with the main story arc and connect the dots, we're doing this because we think it's important. Here's how we're doing it. And if we're successful, and I always like to say that because you can be humble in this approach. And it's one way you can get people to say, oh, I want you to be successful because it's important. If we're successful at doing this, the outcome will be this.
The most important tactic I learned on this, Chris, is you're taught problem, solution, why you, right? Those are the things that you're supposed to go through. And the critical unlocking piece of information that I received was, don't think of it in those terms. Think of it in terms of questions. So you can't always have a two-way conversation when you're presenting. And sometimes people won't answer or ask the questions that you hope they would, right? So you have to kind of be assumptive on the questions. And that's the trick, is to ask the question before you create the slide or the story behind it. So the question is, what's the problem that is most important to me? Right? So now you've asked that question. Now answer that. This is your problem. Now it's okay. So what is a solution? What's a good solution to that problem? Answer that question. And then the next question is, okay, so, and how does your thing tie in? How does your thing solve that problem? It's not just, the solution isn't just what my solution is, but what the solution is, and then how I've implemented that solution. So it's, what is the problem is the first question. The second is, what is the solution? And the third thing is why you? And if you present asking yourself that question before you answer, it really unlocks your ability to tell a story.
I think it's a good place. So let's recap where we've come to. Number one is that we know how critically important it is for us to be good storytellers as founders. Really critical skill. We know it's skills, not attributes. And then starting to unlock the how we do this, we understand there's got to be components of the story. You got to create some tension. You got to create a character. You have to resolve that tension. You have to do it explicitly. And if you miss on that, you miss the resolution of tension. You miss the whole thing. And don't just assume that you've connected the dots. You have to make sure that you explicitly say connecting the dots. I love the idea and the framework of saying, how do you connect the dots? Asking yourself a series of questions, getting in the mind of the person that's listening to your story, and starting to say, what's the information they really want to know? And starting to use that to craft your story. Okay.
The key here is empathy, right? You need to have empathy for the audience. And the best way is, what questions do I need to answer for them? Ask those questions. Yeah.
I think it's a good one. So let's move on to the next logical step in the series, which is, okay, we know the parts of this story, or we know stories are important. We know the parts of the story. Okay, you got to do it. But we also know that there's other stuff involved. So what makes a good business story? What makes a good presentation? What are those little things along the way that you can develop? What are those skills and attributes? So just asking you, Anthony, what makes a good story? What do you think when you hear, hey, this is a good story versus one's like, meh?
Well, I think there's really, it begins and ends with one thing, and that it's authentic. And even better, you hear this word authenticity all the time. What does that mean? It really comes down to, is it true and is it personal? And I always find that telling stories that I have a personal connection with is the most relevant. Sometimes I'll use the statement right? I have, I've had this problem. A lot of times I'll use my mom, where I'll say, my mom thinks your software sucks, right?
Yeah.
And I'll use something that's like, I'm personally connected with my mom, right? And so that, and little old lady from Pasadena literally is having this problem, and you're causing it, usually can develop a hook. Another way of doing it is if you're solving a problem that isn't yours or somebody you're directly connected with, first of all, a lot harder to do. But secondly, if you are, then you need to tell the story from a real person in that situation in order to connect to the person listening.
Yeah. So I think you've hit on, and when you say authenticity, you're actually covering 4 or 5 of the things that we know with psychology around why some stories really resonate with people and some don't. And so authenticity, when you tell a story that is about you, our job in telling a story is to create connection, right? If I'm saying and looking in your eyes and saying, this is why it matters to me, it's really easy to do that. It can be a little bit more difficult if you're using a proxy. If you're saying, hey, my mom is not too bad, because like that's somebody you're deeply connected to.
Yeah.
A lot of times in business pitches, you'll hear people use the hypothetical, which is like,
here's John.
Yeah, exactly.
Generic stock photo of John smiling over his laptop.
Right. Which
doesn't work.
It doesn't really work because John's not a real person. Hypotheticals don't tend to work quite as well. You can create some empathy in hypotheticals, but it tends to be a little bit more difficult. It's way better if you're using the proxy to use a real person that you know, that you've talked to, that you've gotten permission to say, I want to tell you the story of my friend Anthony and the challenges that he went through in creating a podcast. And that's why we built this thing.
So yeah, I think that true personal connection can matter very deeply.
Yeah.
In the effectiveness of the story. What other, Chris, what else? What's something else that makes a good story?
So I think it's the other thing when you said authenticity, and it touches on this, but it's really fascinating. You can tell, like, I get super geeky about this stuff, but the notion of somehow evoking emotion, we know that it's called the affect heuristic, which is we know that something emotional becomes much more memorable. So if you can evoke emotion in me, that emotion, I'm going to ingrain your story deeper in my memory. It's going to be closer to the top of my consciousness. I'm going to think about it more often. It's going to be triggered. That story is going to be triggered more often. However, remember, there's multiple ways to trigger emotion, right? There's good emotion and bad emotion. If you're like, that person was gross, that's a bad emotion, but you're still going to create a deeper neural connection there. So, like, what in your examples, give me an example of a good emotional connection and maybe a bad emotional connection.
Well, we saw a couple of the pitches last week at Denver Startup Week where there was somebody talking about their kid, and you could see it hit them, right? Like they were talking about their kid struggling, which got everybody like
every parent in the room went.
Yeah.
And probably a lot of non-parents too.
Yeah, so that worked. When when it doesn't work, I go back. Not everybody's going to know this reference, but there's a Friends episode where Monica is she's speaking at her parents' anniversary, and she's trying to get people to cry, talking about her dead dog. Like, and she even says, "Remember." Or no, her dead grandma. She's like, remember, she's dead. Right. when you subtlety here matters.
But I think the first word was right, which is authenticity.
Yeah.
Which is, am I being authentic to the story I'm trying to tell? In that particular case, it's a sense of juxtaposition of saying, hey, I'd like to talk to you today about how awesome, How to Found Your Podcast is, and my dead dog. Like, those two things just don't make sense in the same story, right? Like, wait, what? Yeah.
But it's also, it's also the way in which, right? So we do this for when talking about Pro Founder Network, and we mean it deeply in that, this founders need connection. And primarily, one of our big reasons is that being a founder you have a higher incidence of you can go down anxiety,
depression,
stress,
right,
depression, high rate of suicide, and talking about it. We actually care about that. And wanting to help fix that's part of what we want to help fix are those things. Now, you're not going to take the stress and anxiety out of being a founder, but at least you have tools and ways to deal with it. if we leaned on that as our primary reason for being, and we overstated that and made it melodramatic, it not only comes off inauthentic, it comes off ick, right? It comes off, it's like, ew, you're gonna use that to try to sell me fill in the blank. And so you just got to be really careful. Chris, I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you strike that balance?
So it's a wildly interesting thing, and I don't have any data that backs this up other than my experience as a growth marketer for 15 years, which is in growth marketing, we talk about personas and drivers and what motivates somebody, what attaches somebody to your product and service. A negative driver always works better. So in other words, something sad, bad, terrifying, etc.
You're losing something,
but it only works once, right? People, you will get.
Oh, that's good.
I think there's actually bias. I'm looking at my bias. I think it's called negativity bias or something like that, where bad news travels faster than good news. It does work better, but for a brand, you can't do it. You can't. You have to have positivity. You can create tension with the fact of us saying, hey, look, we know how important founders are to society. They're the ones who create value. We also know the founders are feeling lonely, isolated, depressed. They abuse drugs and alcohol more, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of divorce, all that. However, we've created a positive solution. So the positive outcome here is what you have to focus on. Because at the end of the day, we want founders to be successful, and we think our tools are the ways that we can make sure the founders are successful and create this incredible thing for our society. That's a positive outcome. And so the negative piece, you can't sit with. It's funny. It's a weird deal. It works, but long term, it will backfire. And I have 150 examples of people that have
Give me one. Give me one.
Oh, I mean, crap. We did it with Clever Funnel. We were just like, your marketing is stupid. We kind of did the insulting thing, right? And say it was like, oh, don't be stupid, don't be dumb. And like, it gets very high click-through rate the first time you do it. The second time to the same audience, people are like, fuck you, quit calling me stupid. Like, there's a backlash effect that happens.
Yeah. That's a good point. So talk about some of the things. So if we're trying to compel somebody towards action, right? There's this thing called the Life Force 8 that I love this framework from a book called Cashvertising that talks about how do you, like, some of the, do I want to say tricks you can use?
They're what we would say is drivers, right? What
drivers
that motivate. What is it that ties a person to a product or service?
Yeah. So you want to walk through some of those?
Well, so I think the Life Force 8 is really interesting because it is what it's associated with is a very old but now very important set of I think it's research or beliefs called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what they do is they say we as human beings have a ladder of things that we care about. If we don't have food and shelter and we don't have those basic life needs taken care of, we don't care about anything else. But after you solve one thing, you can move up. So some of the big things, and some of this is Life Force 8, some of it are just the broader heuristics that we know of. In group, social or sexual.
I've got them listed here for you, Chris. So survival, enjoyment of life and life extension. That's one.
Yeah.
Enjoyment of food and beverage. That's another.
Yeah.
Freedom from fear, pain, or danger.
Yeah.
Sexual companionship.
Yeah. Sexual companionship.
Comfortable living conditions.
Yeah. Comfort that
you're
moving up the hierarchy.
Being to be superior, winning, keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing.
Yes. And that's called like in group or status prestige.
Right.
Yeah.
Care and protection of loved ones.
Yeah.
And social approval.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with those, right? And I think that there's different ways to slice these concepts. But at the end of the day, if a compelling story, a very compelling story, not only is authentic, but ties into something very primal that the listener has too. So it's a commonality that we have in common. And so I'll give you an example, which is story one is I walked out this morning and got in my Bentley and sat, and it was really hard to get through the traffic to get to my private plane that I then flew to Aspen. Story two is I walked into the middle school lunchroom and I didn't have a place to sit. And I looked around in a sense of panic, thinking that everyone was looking at me, trying to find a friend that I could sit with on the first day of school. Which of those two resonated the most, right? Very few people have the Bentley.
The truth is, it depends on your audience, right? So if your audience is a bunch of Bentley owners who live in Aspen, right? They're gonna, and if your audience is impoverished kids that don't go to school, both of them you're out of touch.
Right. I mean,
right.
The point here is that, and I think it's a good place for us to kind of zoom back out and say, okay, we've talked about components of the story, why story is important, what is the components of a story, and then what are the elements of making a good story. So we talked about authenticity, and this is about that sense of connection. So in that sense of connection, how can you create connection?
Relevance, right? It's connection and relevance. It's like, know your audience and try to connect with them or have relevance for them to what you're trying to convey.
Emotion, very good, but again, be careful. It is one of those double-edged swords. The negative emotion can be. One last one let's talk about, Anthony, which is, I personally think we're hilarious. And so humor is easy for us.
Well, I think there's the list of what to do, and I think there's a list of what not to do, right? Let's talk about the list of what not to do, because I think humor falls on the line there. Like if you know you're funny, then you might be able to use humor. Otherwise, don't use humor.
And I would say the main thing, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. There was a pitch that we heard during Denver Startup Week where it was programmed humor. It was like, insert funny joke here. And he said the joke, and it was like one of the jokes. And then he made
oh, that's clever. Yeah. That was clever. No laughs, crickets.
Out like, well, that was my joke. So I was like, it's dangerous. I think humor is incredibly important and can be an incredible lever in your storytelling arsenal. But again, you have to be careful. You don't want to do it in a way that's not authentic to you. You don't want to tell a joke that you wouldn't tell to your friends. We're goofy. We use dad jokes all the time and puns. That feels great. And it also feels great when somebody goes, oh, that's stupid. Like, I love that, right? That's super authentic to the way that we communicate it on an everyday basis. Trying to do a sophisticated joke that Jerry Seinfeld is probably not going to work for me, right? Comics go up every night for a year to establish a set for a reason. Like most of their stuff falls flat. What makes you think that, unless you're a stand-up comic, you got to be really careful here. It's really hard to be funny. How many pitches have you seen fall apart after a joke went bad? Completely. I'll tell you something. And again, this is another one of those things, super advanced skill. Self-deprecating humor is great, but you can only use it once. The moment you go into any sort of a story and you be like, well, I'm sort of silly, whatever.
And you gotta be careful, because sometimes self-deprecating humor could come across as you being authentically shitty at something. Right?
So, the joke is that, or the kind of the notion is like, you can use self-deprecating humor, but people are going to start to believe it. And so, like, oh, well, I'm just an idiot. Like
the only time I've ever used it is when I talk about what my wife thinks about me. And that works, right? It's like, my wife wouldn't agree, but
it's a way. And I think that there's something that I teach my class is that there's power in your opposite. And so if you're somebody that comes across as very forceful, and very, very direct and very confident, a little bit of self-deprecating humor can help diffuse that a little bit. If you're somebody that's not confident and you're a little bit scared and you're a little shaky, being like, I'm not that smart, that does not come off great.
Does not come across well at all. What else? What's some other things that don't do's?
Well, again, so I think use humor, use emotion, use those things, but just be careful about overusing them. And one of the things, the key here is you got to practice, right? And so practice using them and see how they land. Don't data dump. Don't come in and throw facts and figures at people. It's not part of any story. If I throw more than a number or two at people, we don't have the cognition, the short-term memory to keep more than, I think, what is this, like 7 numbers in our brains at any given time. And so be very careful about just throwing out statistics. Some of it's powerful, but you can use a statistic to make a point. Just don't throw so much data at people. Don't like, we do this wrong every single time we do this podcast. Don't ramble. Don't monologue. Don't go on long diatribes or fall down rabbit holes, which is literally what we do twice a week.
We're paid to do it, though. Yeah. It counts.
I think that, yeah.
Well, eventually. Sorry, I keep coughing, everybody.
Choked up.
We also saw somebody during Denver Startup Week, not to keep bringing that up, that technically speaking, he gave a great pitch, but was so over the top that I don't remember what the pitch was about. I just remember the over topness of it. So there's also this form over function thing that you need to think about. I made this mistake myself. I made the most beautiful pitch decks on the planet. They were animated, well connected, beautiful, great stories, great. And I told the story with animation, like they were beautiful. And at the end of the presentation, I was asked, "What did you make that in?" People would come up to me about this company that I was trying to get investment for and go, "That was the best deck I have ever seen. What did you craft it in? Who made that for you?"
Yeah.
And I asked them to talk about the company, and they're like, "I don't care about the company. I care about the deck." So when the method of presenting outshines the content, you've overdone it. And that can come across in the deck, which I made the mistake. It came across last week from somebody that was so performative that you lost the content.
Yeah. I think that this goes back to a very central point, which is, what is the purpose of being a good storyteller? It's to make connection. And so whether it's a connection with a potential customer, it's an employee, it's an investor, it's a board member, it's an advisor, whoever that is, our job is to make connection. And to do that, you have to be authentic. I can't show up and pretend to be somebody else. I have to be myself. So
yeah, but what if you're an asshole?
I mean, Steve Jobs did it, and so does Elon Musk, right? Like, they don't pretend to be non-assholes, right? Like, they show up and are who they are. So I'm going to go through and recap, and let's figure out any last advice that we can give people on becoming better storytellers.
Well, there's one more question that I have, Chris, sure, and that is, so you mentioned, one of the keys here is to practice. Where do I practice?
It's a great point. Yeah. The old saying is when I used to teach public speaking, I said, sit in front of a mirror and give your speech. That's a fucking terrible idea.
It's a terrible idea.
It's like, oh my God, it's so.
Well, it's good to remember that, like, it's good to practice on your own, going through, if you have slides, right, or index cards, and going through it over and over again, so you have in your mind what the next slide is, so you can do segues, right? You can go, my next point is this, so I can connect the point I'm on to the point that I'm going to. Yeah, and remembering the order is really important. But how do I practice in front of people?
I think it's a great point. So there's several organizations. One that we both love. Denver's got a great chapter. I think you said there's three. Is 1 million cups in Colorado. Like 1 million.
There's one in Fort Collins, one in Denver, one in Boulder, one in Colorado Springs. There's 4 chapters in Colorado.
But
So
they really are all over the world. I think.
And it's any deck. They basically pick 2 people to pitch their deck, and then you can get feedback from the audience. It's a great, typically welcoming organization for you to go in and a friendly environment to no stakes environment. Where else, Chris?
I think, the one that's classic is Toastmasters. There's Toastmasters chapters. I mean, there's probably a dozen Toastmasters chapters in Colorado. It's an opportunity to go and work on the practical skills of being a good public speaker and presenter. And so maybe it's storytelling, but it's also, we haven't even really talked about how to be a good public speaker. Like, those are all skills. They're not, people are not born great public speakers. Toastmasters is really dedicated to helping people become better at that. And then, as far as resources goes, I guess we're skipping ahead, but resources is start to mechanically listen to stories and deconstruct them and see what makes them great or bad.
Yeah.
Just think about the story structure, just the basic story structure, and say, what part of this story, what did this storyteller do to surprise someone along the way? Did they foreshadow? Did they offer a contrarian opinion about something? What was the thing that really helped this story become engaging? And there's, I was looking up earlier, I think, the podcast that I like is The Moth. There's another podcast called Risk, which is kind of more risque stories. This American Life is incredible.
It's great.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many places where you can just go listen or watch a story or anything that TED does, right? Every TED Talk, almost every single one is fucking great. Even if you don't learn something, just watch how they tell the story and how it unfolds. It's really, really remarkable. Any others for you that you say to go look at and start to dissect?
Well, it's funny because I just realized that this episode that we're producing is there's two parts of this. It's one, what is a good story? And 2, what is a good storyteller? Mm. And those are, you have to do both.
I think it's a great point. Maybe it's another episode where we just say, hey, if this one's really about the story and about the elements of this story, how you as a human show up and do that. And again, being good at public speaking is a skill. People say
skill.
The famous Jerry Seinfeld quote, people say that they're more afraid of public speaking than they are death, which means people are more scared to give
They'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy.
Right. That's a pretty good joke, right? So it's that crazy about but just that practicing component. So I think it's a good one. Maybe we talk more about it. Okay. So let's sum up, Anthony. If you could summarize the lessons we've taken away from this podcast, what do you think the core lessons that a founder needs to take away from this conversation? So
be authentic, meaning if you can, have a personal connection to the story you're telling. Don't overtell the story, right? So if you have a 3-minute presentation, don't use 2 minutes of it on the setup story. Be careful with humor. Be careful with trying to force it. Practice the hell out of it. If you're telling the story, practice it. Test it. That's what practicing is about. So if it's a story you're telling in text, do A/B testing with that text to make sure the story resonates. And make sure you treat storytelling as a craft, as a skill. Get better at it. It's one of those things that should be on your list of how do I become a better storyteller? Did I catch everything?
I think so. Understanding the components of the story and make sure you're continuing to close the loop. I think it's story. And I think this is the piece that was kind of funny is we're closing the loop on this podcast. You started by saying, I used not to like storytelling because I used to like things that were very structurally like spreadsheets or coding, et cetera. And I think the contrarian point of view here is that's exactly what a story is. A story has component parts. You can break it down. You can add things to it to rev up the story. But at the end of it, it has to have a beginning, middle, and end. It has to have a main character. It has to have some sort of tension. You have to resolve that tension. All those things have to be true for every single story. And everybody can become a great storyteller. It is not an innate skill. Go work on it. Go practice. Unbelievable. I love talking about storytelling. It's just one of the things I'm super passionate about. Thanks for doing this episode twice because it's been great.
By the way, when did this recording end? Yeah. It's not recording right now.
Oh, fucking hey, that would be just crazy. So I'm going to talk about some resources. We've already talked about some podcasts to go into. Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. Great book. It talks about that notion of creating brands. Some of the stuff that we have been developing around helping people go to market is about creating that story. Really important book. The Storytelling Edge by Shane Snow and Joe Lazowskis. Still, the name has not gotten easier since the second time I read it. Focus on storytelling drives business results and how to craft powerful stories. The Power of Moments by Chip Heath and Dan Heath. Start with Why by Simon Sinek. A few others, just ones that I really like. I mentioned the Moth podcast. One of the main storytellers that has won several of the competitions wrote a book called Story Worthy. It's Matthew Dix, I think, is the author. Matthew Dix. Terrific book that gives you those, like, here is how he crafts a great story. A really good book. Any others that you could think of, Anthony?
No, that's a pretty comprehensive list of books that I'm not going to read.
And I think, but the other point is going out and practicing, finding local organizations, just find another group of founders and work on it. Being like, hey, I need to tell my founder story. Founder story, particularly for early stage company, that's your brand. Don't worry about anything else about your brand. Your story.
One last quick tip. When you're telling a founder story, when you're telling your story, tell your story, ask for feedback, and shut up. Don't try to describe how the person missed it, because the gaps that the person's like, I didn't understand this part, or you can do this better, are indications on how to make your story better. So shut up, take the feedback, and then tell the story to somebody else that's never heard it before.
That's way fucking harder to do.
It really is. It really is hard to do.
Awesome conversation, Anthony. I love that I got you so choked up on talking about stories. We are recording this on Wednesday to be broadcast tomorrow, but what's happening next week?
So that's it for this How to Founder. Next week, we're going to be talking about building a strong company culture. Or in layman's terms, if you don't work on culture, it doesn't mean you won't have a culture. It means you'll probably have the culture you don't want.
And I think your storytelling goes into that too. So it's a good.
It absolutely does.
Going into that. That's awesome.
All right. Remember to follow us. Yeah. Remember to follow us on linkedin.com/company/howtofounder. We are also can be found on YouTube at youtube.com/@howtofounder. And I made a promise to get us on Apple Podcasts, so I need to look into that. But I'm going to try to get our episodes up on get the How to Founder podcast on the Apple Podcast.
Apple Podcast. It's going to be
the How to Apple Founder
right.
Apple.
I think it's pretty much. It could be a subtitle of what we're doing anyway. We talk about Steve Jobs so much. It's just How to Apple. Like, I think it's great.
How to Apple. We're going to start another podcast called How to Steve Jobs.
How to Steve Jobs. How to Jobs this motherfucker. Let's go.
JMF is what we'll call it. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
All right,
bye.